Everyone. We'll be starting shortly, but before we start, can I kindly request that everyone keeps their microphones muted so we can hear the speakers? Thank you very much. So once again, very good morning and a warm welcome to the Women's International Forum's May event. Our topic today is Power Shift, the Longest Revolution and Uprising by Women, with Sally Armstrong, who's joining us from Toronto, if I'm not mistaken. So thank you very much, Sally, for accepting our invitation. My name is Zarina Varukati, and I'm the president of the Women's International Forum. I'm also the spouse of the Singapore ambassador and permanent representative to the United Nations. And a big thank you also to our WIF members for joining us and supporting WIF throughout this pandemic as we tried to put together a program that will be of interest to you. The executive board of WIF is also really pleased to have so many of you join us every month. I would also like to acknowledge and thank new members who have joined us and new spouses of the ambassadors and permanent representatives, as well as the deputy permanent representatives who join us today. So a warm welcome to the Women's International Forum. And since we have several new members and friends, please allow me to present a brief recap of what we do at WIF. WIF was established in 1976 by a group of spouses of the permanent representatives to the United Nations with the intention of providing a forum for the exchange of views and ideas to help our members better understand the world and the current issues dominating the global stage. Our membership includes members of the Diplomatic Corps, as well as distinguished members of New York Society. We are an NGO and a nonprofit affiliated to the United Nations, and we aim to support the work of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. Today's session will be moderated by Arlene Ray, one of the executive board members, and the spouse of the Canadian ambassador and permanent representative to the United Nations. So a quick remark on the order of proceedings. We will begin with opening remarks from Sally, followed by a moderator-led Q&A. You will then have a chance to ask questions at the end of the moderator-led Q&A. So if you wish to ask questions, please indicate your name on the bottom right corner where there's a chat function, and we will call you in the order that your name appears. So now it gives me a great pleasure to introduce Sally Armstrong from Canada, who's joining us from Toronto. Sally is an award-winning journalist, author, and a human rights activist. She has covered stories about women and girls in zones of conflict all over the world, from Bosnia and Somalia to Middle East, Rwanda, Congo, Afghanistan, South Sudan, and Iraq. She's become known as the war correspondent for the world's women. Her eyewitness reports have earned her awards, including the Gold Award from the National Magazine Awards Foundation. She received 4 times the Amnesty International Media Award, and she was a member of the International Women's Commission, a UN body whose mandate was to assist with the path to peace in the Middle East. Sally was named a Massey Lecturer for 2019. The lectures and book are titled Power Shift, the Longest Revolution, which have been recently published. In addition to her journalism, Sally is also the author of several books, including Veiled Thread, The Hidden Power of Women of Afghanistan, The 9 Lives of Charlotte Taylor, Bitter Roots, Tender Shoots, The Uncertain Fate of Afghanistan's Women, and her most recent title, Ascent of Women, A New Age is Dawning for Every Mother's Daughter. In recognition of her work, Sally was promoted to Officer of the Order of Canada in 2017. And it is now my great privilege and pleasure to invite Sally to take the microphone. Thank you, Sally. Sally, yeah, you have to unmute.
Okay, how's that? Am I with you?
Perfect, very clear.
I'll start again. I was just saying thank you to Zarina for that lovely introduction and to say to you how honored I am to be invited to speak to your group. this morning. But what a time for our meeting. I mean, does this year not bring new meaning to the term annus horribilis? I'm thinking that while your countries and mine are still at various stages of coping with this dreadful pandemic, the experts seem to be suggesting that the end of this really long, dark tunnel is perhaps coming to us as long as our vaccines can continue to outrun the variants. What a time we've been living through. But I want to talk to you this morning about the changes that are going to come, and I'll say most particularly to women now that I know it's a mostly women's audience. And this is going to happen as we enter a post-pandemic period. The changes are in store for all of us. Some of them, though, have been mustering for a little while, and others have come about because of the emergency situations we've all found ourselves to be in. There's been a re-emergence of what we always knew as the common good. But on top of that, I can tell you, the way we use power is also changing and is being analyzed and presented in a new way. And those changes, they're going to affect everything we do in our lives. As Zarina said, I'm a journalist. I work in zones of conflict. And my beat is to find out what happens to women and girls in places like Afghanistan, Iraq, South Sudan, most recently Guatemala, and every once in a while here at home. And I can tell you that while I'm on assignment in these places and in zones of conflict, we know that women and girls are punished more severely than soldiers are. But in these places, I began to see a growing shift in the way power is used. And that shift has to do with what I call personal will. Let me explain that to you. We've always depended on political will and public will to change up the agenda. We asked for the stroke of the politician's pen so we can get the stop sign put in at the village, or build a new shelter for women, or change the law. But it takes public will to push that politician to sign that paper. And we've all been part of that. Most of us have been part of that public will. We march, we sign petitions, we raise the roof, we make ourselves and our feelings known to the politician. And that has worked pretty well for probably a century. But what I'm seeing is new. What I'm seeing is the use of personal will. And this, I believe, is the driving force behind major changes and changes to the way public and political will are used. I think Malala Yousafzai would be a fabulous example of this. Remember, she was only 15 years old, living in the Swat Valley in Pakistan. She wanted to go to school to learn to think for herself. And the Taliban, that collection of thugs, mostly illiterate thugs, by the way, they said to her, if you go to school, we'll kill you. She's 15. And she defied them. She got on the school bus, and the last thing she remembers, it was October the 8th, 2012, she saw two guys get on the school bus, and they said, which one is Malala? And they shot a 15-year-old girl in the head, claiming they were acting in the name of God. That's what the Taliban does. But as much as the story of Malala is not unusual, we know these stories happen in many places around the world, but her story hit the front page. Why? Because women's stories are now finding their way to the headline. And Malala, as we all know, had treatment. She survived. She came back, and she started a movement that all girls in the world had to go to school. Because if you can learn to think for yourself, you can probably make a whole lot of changes. But Malala, she's become the world's daughter. You know her, I know her, my grandchildren know her. She did what she did, not because of political or public will. She did it because of personal will that propelled her to make change. And she's done it. There's another example I want to give you. It's now known as the case of the 160 girls. It happened in Kenya. And it's 160 girls between the ages of 3 and 17 sued the government of Kenya for failing to protect them from being raped. Can you imagine? I mean, who ever heard of girls doing such a thing? But this case started because of personal will. The girls are staying in a place called Meru, which is about 4 hours north of Nairobi. And this little girl called Millie, 12 years old, She lives in a village near Meru, and she was at a village meeting because they were talking about building a school. And Millie, age 12, went to that meeting, and she stood up at the meeting and she said, I want to go to school, but I can't go to school because I'm pregnant. And I'm pregnant because that man sitting right there raped me. That is personal will. I mean, it's astonishing that Millie ever had the nerve to say it. But the personal will of that girl made history, because that began the famous case of the 160 girls that went to the Supreme Court of Kenya. And when they won it for 10 million girls in Kenya. In fact, I wrote it in the New York Times the next day, which was a great assignment for a journalist from Canada. And now in Kenya, both public and political will are behind the personal will of the kids that fought that case. And you know, I see this as the incredible power of these young people who are taking on the status quo and demanding change, like Malala, like Millie, like Greta Thunberg, who took on the environment story, even like that young man, David Hogg, remember from the high school, the Douglas Stoneham High School that had that terrible mass shooting. And he took up the cause of no more guns. And what these people, and they're mostly young, and they're mostly girls, what they're saying is what you're doing is not okay with me. And this is a powerful, electrifying message that they're sending to the public. And I believe that is precisely what's driving the bus for change today. Because it's actions like that that have created a power shift. There's two authors, Jeremy Hymans and Henry Timms. They think they've got the formula for what this switch in power is. And they've written a book called The New Power. And they describe old power. Now, I would say old power is what you and I are very familiar with. We either worked for people who used old power, or we were bosses and used old power ourselves, or we were citizens and saw old power. They describe old power this way. They say it works like a currency. It's held by few. Once gained, it's jealously guarded. The powerful have a substantial store of it to spend. It's closed. It's inaccessible, it's leader-driven, it downloads, and it captures. Does that sound like anyone you ever worked for? I can certainly relate to this. As for the new power, they describe the new power this way. It operates like a current. It's made by many, it's open, participatory, and peer-driven. It uploads and it distributes. Like water and electricity, it's most powerful when it surges. The goal with the new power is not to hoard it, but to channel it. And they say that hashtag #MeToo is one of the best examples of the new power, because they say it gives a sense of power to every single participant, that each individual story is strengthened by the surge of the much larger current. I think it's a fabulous example. Another fabulous example would be the Black Lives Matter movement today. It is surging, it is gathering, it is moving forward, it is changing perceptions. And you know what else is, in my opinion, is the extraordinary display of what we used to call the common good. Obviously, it's because of the pandemic that we're seeing this, but the show of support for frontline workers. I don't know about you, but last spring, everyone in Toronto was out on the balcony, banging pots together, clapping their hands to show support for the frontline workers in this pandemic. But it was more than just you and I. I remember when the hospitals were almost panicking because they thought they didn't have enough ventilators. And it was the auto workers who stepped up to the plate and said, we know how to make ventilators. We'll just alter our line and we'll start pumping out ventilators. And they did. And even very recently, when we heard that the Pfizer vaccine had to be stored at incredibly low refrigeration temperatures, excuse me, who stepped up to that plate? Ice cream makers. Whoever could believe this? But people who make ice cream know a little bit about refrigeration. And they said, we know how to do that. We will make those refrigeration units that can store Pfizer vaccine. And that's exactly what they did. But to come back to you and I and the part we played, the new phrase that came up with COVID and peppers every greeting, every passing person on the street is the words, stay safe. We say it to our kids. We say it to our friends. We say it to absolute strangers. These events have, in my opinion, reignited what we knew as the common good. And you know, it also made us pay more attention to the struggles that people on the margins have had to endure. And for my work, because I've spent my whole career writing about the status of women and girls, it has brought into sharp relief the kinds of power that women didn't have, need to have, should have. You know, I think for my whole life, even when I was a young girl, I wondered why women were oppressed. How the heck did that happen? So when I was asked to be the Massey lecturer in 2019, I couldn't believe my ears. The topic they gave me was, why are women oppressed? When did this start? And where are women today? I thought I'd won the jackpot. Here was the topic I'd spent all of my career and my master's thesis and everything else working on. And suddenly they wanted to make it a headline. And of course, it was already a headline. But when you're asked to be the Massey lecturer in this country, that's a big deal. It's also the hardest job I've ever had. For those of you who are not familiar with the Massey lecture, they give you a topic. You have 7 months to write a book of original research, and you divide that book into 5 chapters. Then, when it's finished, edited, and all that hard work, you take those 5 chapters and you shape them into 1-hour lectures. And the 5 lectures are delivered in 5 different cities across Canada. And then, when that's finished, they're broadcast. And they're broadcast on CBC in Canada, NPR in the United States, and ABC in Australia. So you suddenly have a very, very big audience. And as I said, it's a heck of a hard job, but I loved it. One of the most interesting things I discovered almost immediately was that women's history is flawed. You know what happened? The anthropologists and the archaeologists who opened those old files from the Pleistocene and the Paleolithic and the Stone Age, they were all men, and there's nothing wrong with that, because back in the day, that's what men were doing, all the big jobs. But when they studied those eras, they only looked at men. It is unbelievable to me. They only looked at what men were doing. So the data we had from those eras was only about men, as though women didn't exist. Remember that expression, man the hunter? So it's bogus. There is no evidence to say she wasn't hunting right beside him. And there's a lot of evidence now to show that they had a very egalitarian life. Because now the new anthropologists, and they're women, as well as young men, but they realized that without half the population, the data we've been depending on was flawed. So when I started the Massey lectures, these are the people I contacted, and I'm so lucky because they downloaded their files to me because they too were excited to get the facts out. You perhaps have heard of the late Gerda Lerner, who's been hailed as one of the most influential figures in any study of gender. And this is what she had to say. Historical scholarship up to the most recent past has seen women as marginal to the making of civilization and as unessential to those pursuits defined as having historic significance. Don't we know that to be true? Because, you know, the research is permeated with assumptions, assertions, and statements of fact that are neither objective nor inclusive. How about mankind? We were told that, oh, that represents everyone. Well, it doesn't. It is an exclusive phrase. It is not inclusive. Remember Amanda Foreman, she's a historian and biographer in England. She put it this way: the hard truth is that in almost every civilization, women have been deemed the secondary sex. It's an idea that is so ingrained, it's been written into history as a biological truth. And don't we know that truth? So my job was to find out how it happened. This is the best part. I went back to all this research, and I discovered well, I didn't discover, I talked to researchers who had discovered at the end of the Stone Age and the beginning of what they call the agriculture era, something happened. Instead of having to kill and eat today in order to survive till tomorrow, they began to have a surplus of food. When you know a surplus of food would be involved in change. But they had that surplus of food, and that allowed them to pause for a minute and think of where they were going down the road. And what did they think of? The very first thought they had was, we need more laborers. And who's going to produce more laborers? Well, pregnant women are going to produce more laborers. And their research showed that men in this agriculture era began acquiring pregnant women to get more workers. And as they were acquiring more women, they were also privatizing land. And that was the birth of patriarchy and the beginning of the oppression of women. And what they didn't do, religion completed. So that by the time laws were codified, women were officially second-class citizens. Now, my Massey lectures, and I'm jumping so much ahead because I know we want to get to the Q&A part, but my Massey lectures painted a fairly positive picture of the progress that women were making. We know the finish line is out there now. We know certain things have to happen in order to get to it. But then the pandemic hit. And then people started calling me and saying, well, are you still as positive as you were about women's progress? I mean, look what's happened. And indeed, as soon as the pandemic hit, it was last March, I think the third week of March, I had an op-ed in the Toronto Star, which is the newspaper here. Actually, I think it's the biggest newspaper here. Globe and Mail is close. And I did it because an organization called the Assaulted Women's Helpline contacted me to say, ever since the lockdown began, we have a 400% increase in calls to the Assaulted Women's Helpline. Here were women locked down with men who were abusing them, and help was not on the way. And on top of that, we started to hear that more women were losing jobs than men were. And I thought, here we go again. We're in a worldwide emergency and we're experiencing same old, same old. Women are being treated badly and they're not getting their fair shake. But then, you know, I had another thought, because at that time we started to analyze who was handling this pandemic best and worst. And as it turns out, countries run by women were doing the best job with running the stopping the pandemic or dealing with the pandemic. That'd be Finland, Germany, New Zealand. And the countries that were doing the worst job were being run by populist men. This would be the US under Trump, and it would be Bolsonaro's treatment of the pandemic in Brazil, also the way Hungary was running it, and even the way Italy was running it. And that kind of thinking reminded me of a column I wrote. I looked it up, and my goodness, it was 22 years ago I wrote this column. I interviewed a woman, not all of you would know her. Her name is Rosemary Brown. She is deceased now. She was a visionary. She was a member of Parliament in Canada, a great leader, a woman who she really could think ahead. And she had fabulous stories to tell and terrific contributions to make to the common good in Canada, Black woman from the West Coast. And in my interview with her, we were talking about the advances that women made in the 60s and 70s. And, you know, I was kind of pumping up all the wins we'd made. And she said to me, you know what, Sally, we made a mistake. I said, what do you mean we made a mistake? She said, we failed to establish credit for what we knew we were already good at. We did not establish credit for teaching, nursing, working daycare. And you know, her words came back to me last spring when our ravaged lifestyle and our collapsing economy were trying to resurface after the first wave of the pandemic. And I thought back to that time, you know, in the 60s and 70s, we were so busy fighting for the right to be pipe fitters and fighting for the right to be astronauts. We did not consider the fact that we own the podium when it comes to teaching, nursing, working daycare, I dare say working long-term care. So fast forward to today, where would we be without these nurses, these brave, well-trained, courageous nurses? And you know what else we discovered? You can't restart the economy until you can get the kids back to school. And we want those kids back in school with professional, qualified, trained teachers. We learned quickly as parents that we didn't know how to do grade 5 math. And furthermore, we had our own jobs to do. And this was, I think, an incredibly important lesson to learn. And we learned that if you don't treat workers, long-term care workers, for example, with respect and pay them a decent wage, there's going to be trouble. Not just moral trouble. As it turns out, you carry that pandemic place to place because you simply cannot afford to only have one job. So we were learning those lessons. And you know, in the 90s, whenever anyone wanted to balance a budget, who'd they lay off? They laid off the teachers, they laid off the nurses, and they laid off the long-term care workers. There were great lessons for us to learn about women during this pandemic. But another lesson was learned, and it was learned by two researchers at Harvard. They're called Jack Zenger and Joseph Falkman. And they did a study on how women were coping during the pandemic. And it was published in the Harvard Business Review in December 2020, just a few months ago. They start off by speaking of the glass cliff. Now, you and I know what the glass ceiling is. When women rise up in a company, they seem to only get so far, and they've got to bust through this glass ceiling to get to the next step. But they describe the glass cliff as when women are finally given a chance to prove themselves in a senior position, they're handed something that is already broken and where the chances of failure are high. I suppose we can relate to that. But the part of their study that really fascinated me was they asked the respondents what was important to them in a leader during a crisis. And the respondents said they need someone who inspires and motivates, communicates powerfully, has collaboration and teamwork, does relationship building. All of these skills they rated women much more highly on than they did men. And the analysis concluded that female leaders expressed more awareness of fears of others that others might be feeling during this crisis, that females had concern for the well-being and the confidence of the plans that people had going forward. I mean, does this not sound like our wheelhouse? Perhaps the most valuable part of this study to me was what they saw in leaders going forward. What do we need now? And it described leaders who are able to pivot, who can learn new skills, who can emphasize employee development, even during a crisis, who can display honesty and integrity, who are sensitive and understanding of the stress, the anxiety, the frustrations people are feeling. These are traits always displayed by women. But before now, these traits were seen as a sign of weakness among women working toward leadership. They were told to toughen up, never mind how everybody's feeling. Now we find out that is the trait that is going to move all of us forward. You know, we are going into a new era, and it's going to take all of us, men and women, to pick up on the common good and to launch this post-COVID time. And if we're lucky and if we're smart, we're going to launch it with our best selves. You know, it's not unusual to want to right a wrong, help someone in trouble, stop an injustice. But what is rare is that actually being proactive about those things, actually putting action to those words. You know, when we see evil, we can be altruistic and do something about it. Or we can look the other way. There's no cop out there giving you a ticket for not being nice. It was Hannah Arendt, the philosopher and writer who devoted much of her adult life to trying to analyze the nature of good and evil. She's the one who spoke this way. You know, she wrote that book, Eichmann in Jerusalem. She went to Jerusalem to attend the trial of Adolf Eichmann, who bears much of the responsibility for the Holocaust. And she went because she thought if she saw that man and looked in his face, she'd know what evil was. Well, she saw a pretty ordinary looking guy. And her conclusion is that evil thrives on apathy and it cannot exist without it. Hence, apathy is evil. Because you see, when injustice encounters inertia, it uses that passivity exactly as though it were approval. And in the absence of protest, evil is nourished, and indeed, it can flourish. The nature of goodness, therefore, bears a very keen resemblance to intervention. You know, individuals who seek to serve their conscience or find meaning in their lives or simply want the quiet splendor of moral growth are obliged to get involved when something is wrong in the community, in the country, in the world, as you people know better than anyone. But most people, as theater critic Walter Kerr once put it, cast themselves in the role of spectator, whatever the provocation to take action. And you've heard their excuses. What do you think I can do? I'm only one person. I'm not rich. I'm not famous. I'm not powerful. How do you expect me to make change? Or as one woman said to me, what if I got involved and made a fool of myself? The trouble with that kind of thinking is that innocent bystander is sometimes an oxymoron. People who do not intervene when something is amiss give tacit permission for injustice to continue. But these are not easy tasks. As we embrace the common good, as we exercise a new form of power, upsetting the status quo is tough. And today, we need to upset the status quo. I mean, you may have to brave the disapproval of your colleagues or the censure of your friends, or even the wrath of society by standing up and saying, what you're doing is not okay with me. It's been said that moral courage is a rarer commodity than bravery in battle or even great intelligence. But I can tell you, it is the one essential, vital quality for those who seek to change the world that yields most painfully to change. You know, change doesn't happen because we want it to happen or because it's fair for a just society. Change happens because people engage in the process. And I can't imagine anyone in the world more engaged in the process of change than you delightful people that work with, around, or for the UN. So thank you for inviting me to join you today.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Sally, for that. I'd like to hand over to Arlene now to take over the moderator-led Q&A.
Thank you so much, Serena, and thank you, Sally, for what was a really, as the words you used, inspiring and motivational speech. I actually expected that it would be much more of a downer, and my question was going to be, are you optimistic about anything? But in fact, you give great optimism for youth and for the capacity for change. But perhaps because we're both recovering from knee surgery, I'm thinking of how when I bicycle and I up the resistance, it gets tougher and tougher, right? And I'm wondering if as women get more active, more out there, more demanding of our rights, if the resistance will grow.
You know, Arlene, I think that's an excellent question. And I'm really glad you asked it because I believe, and it's not because I'm an optimist, it's because I've done the research, I believe that we're past that stage. I think there was a great deal of resistance. I remember being in Afghanistan. I covered Afghanistan from the day the Taliban took over, and I'm still covering it. You'd think I'd learn enough to stay home. But I remember a man in Afghanistan telling me that if women got human rights, he had to give his human rights to her. And that's the kind of resistance that was really palpable in those days. Plus, we know in our cities, in New York, in Toronto, there was so much pushback. Who do you think you are, stepping out and stepping up and speaking out? I think we're past that. And I think even during these difficult days, let me give you an example of why I feel we're past that. Remember, was it February? I want to say the 19th, I'm not sure. Remember when that little craft called Perseverance landed on Mars? Do you remember the countdown? It was a woman from NASA, a woman astrobiologist who did the countdown for the world to listen to. She called it, I believe, 7 minutes of terror. And as she was counting it down to land on Mars, I was so glad it was a woman that was doing it. But even more than that, later, another astrobiologist was interviewed, And the question asked to her was, what was it like being part of this 7-month journey to Mars? You know what she said? She said it was like childbirth. I thought, my heavens, we would never have likened anything to childbirth when we were trying to elevate our status. And here they were landing on Mars. I thought, you know what? We're near the finish line. So I
Yeah.
say that to say, I think the pushback is less because all the studies have been done to show if you include women, look at the work Jeffrey Sachs did. He basically said the status of women in the economy are directly related. Where one's flourishing, so is the other. Where one's in the ditch, so is the other. And I think we've done the studies. We know it to be true.
Sally, thank you. You first went to Afghanistan, I read, in 2002. So it's now the 20-year war, 19 years later, and 20 years that the US and NATO have had troops there. And as you know more than most, the pullout of the troops will be on September 11th, a very powerful anniversary. There are many people on both sides, whether they feel this war needs to end after so much sacrifice and so much time. There are others who feel it's going to be disastrous for the country and particularly for women and girls. So I'm going to ask you the question that you asked, Samir, in your interview for Maclean's. Are you worried?
Well, I'd like to give you a very long answer. I hope that's okay with you, because
Yes.
in fact, the Taliban took over Afghanistan in September the 26th, 1996. That's when I started trying to get into the country, that September. I didn't get in until March of 97, but that's when I began my coverage. So I was there almost the 5 years of the Taliban. And just to remind, because we forget over time, don't we? Like you and I are going to forget the pain of this knee replacement surgery, but we forget. Remember when the Taliban came to power, women couldn't go to work, girls couldn't go to school, you weren't not allowed to have health care. The edicts got crazier and crazier by the day. You were not allowed to sing. TVs were impaled on posts in the street. You weren't allowed to listen to the radio. There was no clapping. I mean, the children were not allowed to play with toys. Do you know what? I'll tell you something. The first time I went, women were not allowed to wear white socks because it was the color of the Taliban flag. And I thought, well, it's cuckoo, but I'm not going to fight about that. But I went back a few months later, and now that had changed. Now you couldn't wear white socks because they were considered sexually promiscuous. White socks, I'll tell you, it never worked for me. But here, but you see where they're going with this? If you hook the crime to sexuality, the punishment becomes much more severe. As the 5 years that I covered Afghanistan during the Taliban, people were living in terror. You never knew when these thugs were going to come in and beat you up or kill your husband or rape your wife. Well, I can't go into that much detail or you're going to cut me off. But just to say, we forget how absolutely terrible it was. And while the Taliban were in power, they came in after a terrible civil war. They repaired not one single thing. They repaired not a road, not a bridge, not a factory, nothing. They did nothing for the people and nothing for the country. So fast forward. Now we have this situation where the Americans are withdrawing. So I looked at all this data and everyone's been talking about it. Every newspaper, every magazine, every TV show, every radio show has been talking about this withdrawal. And they're asking what the Americans think. They're asking what the international community thinks. They're asking every think tank on the planet. Nobody was asking the Afghan people. So I thought, don't they get a say in this? So I called Dr. Seema Samar. You might remember her. She was a woman, honest to God. I have so many stories about her. She defied the Taliban. She kept her schools for girls open. She kept her clinics for women open. She defied them and she carried on throughout. And then she had quite a career as the world came to the rescue. But I felt she could speak for the people a lot better than you and I can. And you and I seem to be the only ones who are being asked. So my first question to her was, whose fault is this? I mean, it is 20 years. You know what astonishes me? In 1 year, we found a vaccine to save the lives of the whole world. But in 20 years, we could not find a way to make that country find peace. Now, it is tribal and it is primitive, and that's hard, but it's not as hard as finding a vaccine in 1 year. So, so something's wrong here. Something we have to think in a different direction. We have to do something new. And I'm not here to tell you what that is. So I asked her, whose fault is this? She said, first, it's the Americans' fault because they cut a deal with the Taliban. They sat down February 2020 under President Donald Trump and negotiated peace with the Taliban. The Taliban was the enemy. Everyone knows what the Taliban did. And she said that was wrong to negotiate without the government of Afghanistan. And she said, who else is to blame? The international community, because they went along with what the American government was doing at that time. And she said, you know who else is to blame? The Afghan people. We have not discovered a way to bring ourselves together. We don't have unity in our country. So I said, do you blame the Americans for leaving? I mean, 20 years, for God's sakes, all this money, all these people. And she said, I'm not going to discuss who I blame about leaving. I'm going to discuss what you're leaving behind and the fact that you have betrayed the people of this country without leaving us with a blueprint to move forward. So I asked her, I said, what does the Taliban want? She said, everybody knows. They won't say it. They want an Islamic emirate and they want Sharia law. Now, Sharia law is already in the Constitution of Afghanistan in the words of no one can go above Sharia law. But we all know there's not a Muslim country in the world that practices Sharia law the way the Taliban did. There's nothing in the Quran to say a girl can't go to school or a woman can't go to work. Nothing. These thugs were making it up as they went along and getting away with it. We're so afraid, you know, that if we speak up, we're going to step on somebody else's beliefs. Well, you can believe what you like, but you can't say what's not true. And they were saying what was not true. So if you will note from all the stuff you've been reading, the Taliban have not said how they will practice Sharia law. They will not answer that question. Everybody knows what's coming. Just 2 weeks ago, somebody leaked me a video from Herat, a big city. And the Taliban had a girl in the middle of a circle. She's on her knees, she's screaming and crying, and they're whipping her, and they're taking turns whipping her, taking turns. You know what her crime was? She was on her cell phone with a boy. So we know what's coming. So then shall I go on? There's 2 more pieces to this. Do you want me to continue or cut?
We may have to cut if there are questions. So Zarina.
Okay, I'll leave it at that. Just to say that whole region is unstable, all the way from Yemen to China. They're all unstable. They've all got a connection to Al-Qaeda, and trouble is coming. And when the Americans pull out, there'll probably be civil war, and we will ultimately have to deal with this again.
I wish, thank you, Sally. I wish this was 2 hours because I want to ask you about women affecting conflict and poverty and migration and health and everything else and refugees. But I will ask you briefly, what are you working on now? And then I will turn it over. Please answer briefly and then if there are questions from this incredible group, by the way, of women from internationally, many of us in New York, but others in their home country who must have questions as well, and give them a chance. So quickly.
Well, first of all, the answers to those questions you said you don't have time to ask are all in my book, Power Shift, The Longest Revolution. You can order it from Amazon. Now, what am I working on now? I can answer really fast because it's a secret. I am ghostwriting a book that is the most exciting project I've had in my whole career, and I'm not allowed to say. So here's the deal. You have to invite me back next year, and I will tell you about the book. It won't come out until next winter, but it's a heck of a story, and it's going to be all over the world. And I'm going to tell you all the inside story if you invite me back. There, how's that for short?
Thank you so much, Sally. Over to Zarina. I hope there are some questions from our listeners.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Arlene, and thank you very much, Sally. We will definitely invite you again next year when your new book comes out. Yeah, we have a couple of people who've indicated that they have questions. But first, if you allow me, I like to follow up from what you spoke about earlier. You spoke about personal will to bring about change and fighting the system that is against girls and women. How much of this personal will can effect widespread change to the system, in your opinion, or from what you have seen?
You know, Zarina, it's a formula, isn't it? You send the girls to school, you teach them to read and write, they learn to think for themselves. And when you think for yourself, you start saying, what the heck is that for? How come the boys are allowed to play this game and I'm not allowed to play that game? How come you got that job and you're being paid more money than I'm doing the same job? You start asking questions, and that is personal will. When you start saying, what you're doing is not okay with me, then I believe you are starting the biggest change the world has ever known. Now, obviously, you're going to have people that are going to take advantage of that kind of thing. But these young people, these young thinkers, they're popping up all over the place. I can't tell you how much I admire them. You know, well, I won't go into detail because it takes too long, but I assure you, there are other stories that prove these young people, send them to school, they'll learn to think for themselves, and they will make all the changes we've been trying to make.
Thank you very much. It's very optimistic and very hopeful. The future is in the hands of the youth and young girls. We have two participants who have indicated that they would ask questions. I will call Betty Robbins first, and then I'll call Tracy. Betty?
Thank you, Zarina, and thank you, Sally, and everyone on the Board of WIP for this very topical presentation. Betty Robbins from Women for Women. I want to go back to something that you started to address, Sally, and then we shifted off of it, which is what you may have encountered when you first asked your Western employers to send you to war zones to report, and whether there was any particular resistance because you're a woman, and if so, how you addressed it. And then next step, when you got to those war zones, including Afghanistan, whether again you encountered any specific resistance that might have been different from the resistance to other Western news reporters, and how you might have addressed that if the resistance was because you're a woman.
Well, the answer to all of your questions is yes, resistance everywhere you look, because it wasn't something you did. I was the editor-in-chief of a magazine, for heaven's sakes, and women's magazines were known, and we were known for fabulous recipes, but we'd give you the best recipe you ever saw for lasagna on one page, and we'd give you a formula for changing the world on the next. And of course, the publishers didn't like that. I remember a publisher saying to me, I broke the story by the way of the gang raping of women in the Balkans. Remember during the early 90s when they were rounding up the wives, the sisters, the daughters, the mothers of the so-called enemy and gang raping them. I mean, it's an astonishing story. And my publisher said, no one wants to read about rape when they're looking for a recipe for lasagna. I said, are you kidding? They want to read the best read. He said, no, an advertiser doesn't want to go in the magazine when there's a story about rape instead of about lasagna. I said, are you kidding? An advertiser wants to be on the best read page in the magazine. And did I win him over? Well, he didn't stop me, but he didn't love what I was doing. But the reason I could continue was because the readers were just rushing to the magazine. We had a huge readership. And my mentors kept saying to me, as long as they get the ads, they can't stop you. And they were getting the ads because I was bringing in the women. I shouldn't say my whole editorial team. So yes, there was resistance, but we did win. And as for reporting over there, it's not just Western reporters from around the world. It's never easy to go into a war zone and talk to people who don't want you there. And of course, the belligerents don't want you there. And there were other women at the beginning, very few. And as time went on, more and more. And yes, they're against this. And they use all the old tools that we've always had about you belong at home, you don't know anything, or you're too delicate. I love that one. I'm 6 feet tall, by the way. Anyway, yes, to be brief with the answer, there is resistance, but there are ways of getting around it. And now it is much more acceptable. And indeed, I mean, there are as many women as there are men in these zones and every place else in journalism. Having said that, let me add one thing. The sexual harassment of women journalists online is out of control. Yeah. And I believe the reason for that is because Google Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, they don't do anything about it. They could, because they know now. I mean, when we first started getting death threats, my first was in the early 80s, and it came in the way of a letter. But now, and we couldn't identify anything on a telephone. Now you can, and they do nothing about it.
Thank you so much, Sally, and thank you, Betty, for the question. In fact, Sally's the last part of your answer, I think, nicely sort of links to Tracy's question. So I'd like to invite Tracy to ask a question.
Thank you. That was just excellent. Speaking of media, and you gave us a downside to it, but my bigger question has to do with earlier you talked about old power, new power, and you gave these wonderful examples of Malala and Greta and how their message has been conveyed. I just would love to hear your perspective on the media or mediums and the reason that their messages could be communicated so quickly and so widely. Because when you talked about new power and it's current and being peer driven, it's also makes it easier actually for people to have that moral courage to participate when you have a different set of medium where you don't have to go out and you don't have to have your place card, your placard and protest in the street, but you can actually do that from the comfort of your own home. Is there something to that that's creating this perfect storm for advancing these ideas and the issues that are affecting women these days?
I'm not entirely sure I know what you're asking, but when you say perfect storm and you talk about the media,
the availability, the accessibility of media, the way that young people are actually using this to communicate across boundary borders, not thinking about country lines, but just issues, that's faster these days than it was maybe 30 years ago.
That is correct. And it is more efficient and it does spread data. And it is better, but the problems are we aren't holding anyone accountable. I shouldn't say it that way. We need to hold people more accountable than we do. And it comes all the way back to media as we know it. Media is now, I would say it's divided between news and infotainment. I think the cable news networks are more into infotainment, grabbing that reader and feeding a line and feeding a line. And who is accountable for things that are not true? I mean, don't forget, it was the President of the United States that called the media the enemy of the people, a terribly dangerous thing to say. Stalin said that, for God's sake. But media, journalists have got to be accountable for facts. And in my business, if I report something that's not true, I can get fired. And you are supposed to have two sources for everything. And believe me, when the bombs are dropping and you're trying to do a body count, it's pretty hard to get two sources. But we have to hold journalists accountable, whether you're in infotainment and calling yourself a journalist or you're in straight news and you are a professional journalist. We cannot have this, what they're calling fake news, go on. It's a huge problem. But then you move to social media and you're talking about the young people. They are sharing all kinds of data. Some of it is incorrect. Some of it is totally false. Some of it is very problematic. But underneath all of that is this massive amount of information out there. And it's lighting up minds to talk about, why does that happen? And if you live like that, why don't I live like that? And what goes on over here? And how come you got into that and I couldn't get in? These are the conversations that are the change makers. So I think you're right. Social media has an enormous role to play, but we've got to somehow get some accountability in there.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Sally. And you're absolutely right. There has to be some kind of accountability in social media out there. But at the same time, like you said, it's a medium that has allowed more people access to information and awareness of what's happening in other parts of the world. And I think that's a medium that the youth are using to get their message across, bypassing traditional media, censorship and things like that. And I think that's a good thing. We are now almost 1 hour into our talk, and it just leaves me to thank Sally Armstrong very much on behalf of the Women's International Forum for this very fascinating and excellent session. And I promise that you will be back next year. So thank you very much. A big thank you to Sally.
Thank you very much. I love being here.
And